So grade 12, we're going to look at functions today and the inverse of functions. And in order to do that, let me remind you of some of the work that we've done in grade 8 and 9. And do you remember those diagrams that looked like this? You had a diagram with a rule inside the diagram, which we will refer to as an equation. You had your input values, and for each and every input value you have an output value. So, and we're going to use this just to understand functions, understand how it works. So for a function, for any function, you will have your input. The one we usually use is your x value, so it's an input value. And then based on that input value, you have an output value, which will be y for a normal equation like we use. Now, your input value is independent . It's independent. And your output value is dependent on your input value. So your input value, which is independent, has a domain, and your output value, which is dependent on your input value, has a range. We also refer to your output value as your function value. You would remember me saying this many times in class. This is your function value, the y value of this expression. Okay, so mathematics as a theoretical foundation, and then built upon that foundation we've got the application, which is all the calculations. But in order to truly be able to apply with your calculations, you have to understand the language, the terminology. And that's what we are working on now. So, function notation. Function notation, and this is known to you, but just to refer back to that. Y equals x plus 10. There's an equation, y equals x plus 10. X is your input value, your independent value, which has a domain. Y is your output value, which is dependent on your input value, that has a range. And this is also called your function value. Another way of writing this that you will see a lot, and you've seen in grade 11 as well, your function, which is dependent on x, is equal to the equation x plus 10. So now another way of writing this that you don't see that often, personally I've never seen this in a question paper, is to write it as follows. And this means exactly the same as these expressions. So these are function notation, and you need to understand and know this to be applied with a question paper. Okay, so now that you understand functions, we can move on to the inverse of a function. Now what happens with an inverse is the following. These literally just swaps around. Your output value becomes your input value, and your input value becomes your output value. Your dependent variable becomes the independent variable, and the independent variable becomes the dependent variable. Your range becomes the domain, and your domain becomes the range. So for all practical reasons, the x and the y value swaps around. Let's do two examples. The first example is y equals x plus 10, the one that we just had. Now the question is, please write down the equation of the inverse of this function. And how they would ask that is like that. That means the inverse. Now if it was written down as f as a function of x, the inverse will look like that as well. So the very first step is you swap around the x and the y. So you swap the x and the y around, and then you rewrite it in terms of y. And that is the equation of the inverse of this function. So show the swapping around and then write down the final answer. I would like to work through a second example as well, just to make sure that this is not too simplified. And here we go. Y equals 2x plus 5. The question is, write down the expression of the inverse of this function. First step, we swap the x and the y around. So for the inverse, it becomes x equals 2y plus 5. You take the 5 across, x minus 5 equals 2y, and then you divide by 2. And this is the expression for the inverse of this function.